They say you never really own your driveway until someone else decides to use it like it belongs to them. My name is Ethan Carter, and I still remember the exact moment my quiet suburban morning stopped feeling like my own. It was 6:12 a.m. The sky over Willow Creek Estates hung pale gray, the kind of light that makes everything look paused between night and day. Stepping outside holding a warm cup of coffee, I expected nothing but silence, the usual calm, predictable rhythm of a neighborhood that prided itself on strict order. Instead, I froze halfway down the steps. 3 heavy, dark SUVs were parked across my driveway in a flawless, single-file line. They were aligned so precisely, bumper to bumper, that it looked chillingly intentional. Engines off. No movement. No explanation. The morning air smelled faintly of fresh asphalt from last night's repaving, mixed with cut grass and morning dew. A printed notice was taped squarely to my front door, fluttering slightly in the early breeze. I pulled it off and read the bold text, "Temporary HOA parking adjustment for community efficiency." I read it twice, then a third time, waiting for the words to make sense. They didn't. For a long moment, I stayed perfectly still, the coffee cooling in my hand, listening to the distant, surreal hum of a leaf blower somewhere down the street. It sounded like nothing unusual was happening at all, and that stark contrast only made the situation worse. Everything in the neighborhood looked normal, except my property. "Morning, Ethan." A woman walked up the sidewalk with a plastic clipboard tucked firmly under her arm. Karen Miller. As the HOA president, everyone knew her name here, even if they pretended not to. She stopped near the edge of my driveway and looked at the parked vehicles like they had always belonged there. She didn't greet me at first. She didn't need to. Her attention stayed entirely on the grid, not the person standing in it. When she finally spoke, her voice possessed a calm, rehearsed quality, like a customer service agent reading from a script. She claimed this was a temporary reallocation of space for an upcoming community event. I asked how long temporary was supposed to mean. Karen didn't answer directly. Instead, she repeated that it was for the collective benefit of the neighborhood and that my cooperation would avoid unnecessary complications. 2 houses over, the synchronized clicking of lawn sprinklers started right on cue, perfectly timed, as if the street itself were actively ignoring the intrusion in front of my home. Glancing at the vehicles again, their placement felt predatory. They were angled so tightly that leaving would require a level of precision coordination I had never agreed to. Having read the extensive HOA documents thoroughly when I bought the house, I remembered endless phrases about shared standards and property harmony. I did not, however, remember anything about waking up to find your own driveway reassigned without a single word of consent. Karen finally turned her head slightly toward me, not fully facing me, just offering enough of a glance to acknowledge I was a minor variable in her equation. Her expression stayed completely neutral, almost procedural, like this was a routine formality she had performed 100 times before. Compliance, she murmured, would make everything easier for everyone involved. I didn't respond right away, not because I agreed, but because I was trying to process how something so mundane could feel so utterly deliberate. Taking a slow, deep breath, I watched the pale morning light reflect off the windshields blocking my path. In that quiet moment, a cold realization settled in. This was no longer about parking space at all. Karen didn't linger. She simply adjusted her clipboard and walked past me as if I were already part of the background noise. That was the first real red flag, not just the cars themselves, but the absolute, unshakable confidence behind the intrusion. It implied the decision had already been rubber-stamped in a room I couldn't see. My immediate instinct was to handle this like any red-blooded American homeowner would. I pulled out my phone and dialed a local towing company to clear my property. "Sorry, sir," the dispatcher sighed after taking my address. "Willow Creek Estates is flagged in our system as an active traffic optimization zone for the day. We can't haul anything out of there without written clearance from your HOA board." Dumbfounded, I hung up and immediately dialed the local police non-emergency line. The response from the desk sergeant was equally cold, wrapped in bureaucratic indifference. "Sounds like a civil matter, sir. Property and parking disputes within private HOAs have to be resolved through their internal board mechanisms. Unless there's an immediate threat of violence, we can't dispatch an officer." The system was already insulated. Walking closer to the edge of my property line, I looked at the alignment of the vehicles again. Each one had a small, numbered tag displayed on the dashboard. That tiny detail made my stomach tighten slightly. This was not a chaotic overflow parking mistake. This was an organized, military-esque deployment. Farther down the sidewalk, Karen was already speaking to another neighbor, her voice remaining calm and controlled. She explained that the community event required temporary redistribution of driveway access to optimize visitor flow. When asked who exactly approved that optimization, she gave a small, vacant smile that did not reach her eyes. The HOA board, she claimed, had unanimously agreed during an emergency session the night before. No email notice had been sent. No invitation had been extended. I hadn't even seen a physical posting about it on the community boards. Standing there, I listened to the quiet morning sounds around me. Birds chirping in the distance, a lone car passing 2 streets over. Everything felt completely normal, except for the terrifying fact that my private property had been silently reclassified without my input. Karen turned slightly and pointed toward the end of the street. A temporary sign stood staked into the grass, one I hadn't noticed during my initial confusion. Community Parking Coordination Zone. It was printed on standard laminated board, secured tightly like it had always belonged there. A slow realization began building inside me. Not loud, not emotional, just precise. This was not a simple misunderstanding. This was a system. Retreating toward my porch, I refrained from saying anything further. Karen did not follow. She simply made a quick note on her clipboard and walked away in the opposite direction, already moving on to the next house, as if my reaction held zero relevance to her process. Inside, my coffee had gone completely cold on the counter. I opened my laptop and searched the HOA portal for recent meeting records. At first, nothing unusual appeared. Standard maintenance updates, landscaping reminders, and a notice about asphalt resurfacing from last week. Then, tucked away in a hidden subsection, I stumbled upon a link labeled Community Initiatives. Clicking it brought up a prompt requiring login credentials I had never been given. Pausing for a moment, I closed the laptop, realizing the answers wouldn't be found on the surface. Instead, I walked back outside to observe the street more carefully. Over the next hour, a strange wave of conformity washed over the block. Neighbors emerged one by one, slowly realizing their driveways were also occupied. Some stood quietly on their porches, mimicking my disbelief. Others spoke with each other in low, hushed tones near the sidewalks. Remarkably, no one seemed to want to raise their voice. A uniformed contractor vehicle passed through the street, methodically placing small reflective markers along the curbs. The workers moved with a measured, rehearsed pace. Down at the far end of the block, Karen was speaking with 2 people I didn't recognize. They were reviewing a large map spread across the hood of a car. She was pointing at specific sections of the neighborhood, acting as if she were assigning roles in a plan that was already in full motion. I could feel the heavy structure of it now. This was not about parking at all. It was about the control of movement. Who could enter, who could leave, and who had to ask permission for the very space they legally owned. I stayed quiet, watching, listening, and collecting details instead of reacting blindly. Something about the seamless way this was organized told me it would not end where it started. Karen Miller was not improvising. She was executing something she believed was already decided. The morning sun fully settled over Willow Creek Estates, yet the quiet no longer felt natural. It felt heavily managed. Standing near my front steps again, I began observing the street like a system I had to decode, rather than the peaceful place I lived in. The vehicles blocking my driveway remained entirely unchanged in position and unchanged in intent. That specific detail mattered more than anything else. People usually shift their positions when they are uncertain, but these vehicles did not budge an inch. A few minutes past 9 a.m., Karen Miller appeared at the top of the block again. This time, she bypassed my property entirely. She walked with a crisp, military purpose, moving from house to house with the exact same clipboard and the same measured pace. It was fascinating and terrifying to notice how the residents reacted before she even reached their front doors. Some stepped outside early to meet her. Others waited anxiously behind their screen doors. The entire street felt like it was subtly adjusting its posture around her presence. Deciding to follow her at a safe distance, I resolved not to confront, but simply to observe. She stopped at 3 houses in a row, pointing at driveways, marking something on her sheet, and then moving on without a shred of hesitation. At one house, an older gentleman tried to raise an objection, his hands gesturing wildly. Karen responded without slowing her pace for even a second. Her voice drifted back to me, repeating that the adjustments were part of an approved neighborhood optimization plan and that details would be distributed later. No documents were handed over to the homeowner. No printed explanation was visible. There were only instructions delivered verbally and recorded on paper she controlled completely. As I drew closer, I began to notice a clear pattern in the markings on her clipboard. There were small, abstract symbols next to each address. Not names, and not personal notes. Just sterile identifiers. It looked like a grid system rather than a residential neighborhood. When I finally returned to my own driveway, I noticed that one of the SUVs had been repositioned slightly. It hadn't been removed, just adjusted forward by a few feet, as if someone had recalibrated its exact placement. That tiny modification made something click in my mind. This was not about convenience or event parking. It was about measurement. It was the control of physical space down to the precise inch. I went back inside and opened my laptop again, this time focusing my search on the public HOA infrastructure documents. I didn't need special access credentials to view public regulatory filings. Budget allocations, vendor contracts, and historical maintenance schedules were all archived in plain sight. What I found was subtle, but incredibly significant. A new line item labeled External Coordination Services appeared, featuring a contract signed just 2 weeks earlier. The vendor name was completely unfamiliar, but the scope description explicitly mentioned traffic flow management and residential access optimization. I wrote the name down and cross-referenced it with public business registrations. The trail linked back to a private logistics consultancy based out of Sacramento. It wasn't illegal, nor was it entirely unusual on its surface, but it was completely unnecessary for a small, quiet residential community. Leaning back in my chair, I listened to the heavy silence inside my house. Outside, I could hear faint footsteps, occasional car doors shutting, and the soft, murmuring sound of people trying to understand what was happening to their own property. Looking out the window, I spotted Karen speaking to the same contractor vehicle I had noticed earlier. They weren't rushing at all. They were deliberately coordinating. Then, I noticed a detail that completely changed the tone of everything. A second set of markings had begun appearing on the concrete curb lines themselves. Small, highly reflective tags were being placed at perfectly measured intervals. It looked exactly like a mapping system being layered onto the neighborhood in real time. It wasn't random, and it certainly wasn't decorative. It was highly functional. That was the exact moment I stopped thinking of this as a petty parking enforcement dispute. It was something else entirely, a structured control of movement across private property, implemented quietly, one incremental decision at a time. Karen Miller wasn't reacting to chaos. She was actively building order. And whatever system she was constructing, it was already much further along than anyone in the neighborhood realized. By midday, the neighborhood no longer felt like a collection of private family homes. It felt like a heavily controlled environment where invisible boundaries were being drawn in real time. I stayed inside my house for most of the late morning, watching through the front window instead of stepping into conversations that were already starting to circularly repeat themselves on the sidewalks. Every few minutes, a different neighbor would walk outside, stand near their blocked driveway, and then look around anxiously as if waiting for confirmation that what they were seeing was actually real. The SUVs in my driveway remained unchanged, but the reflective curb markers outside had multiplied significantly. They now extended much further down the main street, forming a complex pattern I could easily recognize even from a distance. This was structured spacing, looking exactly as if someone were designing traffic lanes where none had ever existed before. Around 11 a.m., Karen Miller materialized near the center of the block. This time, she wasn't alone. 2 additional people stood flanking her, both holding industrial tablets instead of paper clipboards. They were rapidly scanning addresses and marking coordinates with synchronized, fluid movements. They worked with terrifying speed, no discussion, no hesitation, just automated confirmation and digital recording. One frustrated resident approached the group, trying to ask about a specific driveway restriction that blocked his work truck. Karen didn't even stop walking. She delivered her response while remaining in motion, stating that all changes were part of a temporary compliance framework designed to improve neighborhood accessibility during peak activity cycles. The words sounded officially sanctioned, but they were deliberately, masterfully vague. Having worked for years in systems design, I immediately recognized the language. It was text designed to describe a rigid process without ever revealing who actually held the control. I stepped outside again, walking slowly toward the very edge of my property line. The air felt much warmer now, the morning dew entirely gone, replaced by the dry, radiating heat of the pavement. A commercial delivery truck passed slowly through the street, pausing briefly at each minor intersection as if confirming updated directions on a screen before continuing. Right then, I noticed something else. The curb markers were no longer just placed along private driveways. They were extending directly toward the main street intersections, forming sharp directional guides that fundamentally reshaped how vehicles would enter and exit the neighborhood. That specific detail completely altered my understanding of the scope. This wasn't about parking management within individual driveways. It was about rerouting movement across the entire suburban street grid. Karen finally paused near the house directly across from mine. She pointed toward the driveway there and muttered a brief instruction to one of the tablet operators. Within minutes, a small adjustment was made. A physical marker was moved a mere few inches. Amazingly, that tiny correction triggered a secondary adjustment 3 houses down the block. It behaved exactly like a chain reaction. Watching carefully, I realized every single change created a corresponding change somewhere else in the line. It was a live system responding to itself in real time. Retreating indoors, I pulled up the HOA budget documents on my computer once more. This time, I focused my analysis heavily on the vendor payment schedules. There it was, a recurring automated payment labeled System Calibration Support. The amounts were relatively small individually, but completely consistent, weekly, and fully automated. Cross-referencing the vendor name again, it matched the Sacramento logistics consultancy I had identified earlier, but now a new subcontractor was officially listed under them, a high-end mapping and infrastructure analytics firm I had never heard of. I wrote both corporate names down and compared them against public contracts filed with the county registry. On the surface, nothing unusual was visible. Everything was technically legal. But legality and intent are rarely the same thing. Leaning forward in my chair, I mentally replayed everything I had witnessed outside. The highly coordinated movements, the silent bureaucratic approvals, and the incremental changes that slowly affected the entire street without a single public announcement. This wasn't chaos or small-town overreach. It was a controlled, phased deployment. Karen Miller wasn't improvising her authority. She was executing a prepared structure that most residents simply hadn't recognized yet. Closing the laptop, I looked back outside through the window blinds. One of the SUVs in my driveway had just been shifted again, positioned slightly closer to the new curb marker than it was 20 minutes ago. The adjustment was tiny enough that most people wouldn't even notice it. But I did. And that was exactly when I understood the most brilliant, terrifying part of the system she had built. It didn't need the residents to understand it. It only needed them to comply while it silently expanded. The arrival of the late afternoon brought a suffocating shift in the atmosphere of Willow Creek Estates. It was no longer just simple tension or irritation between neighbors. It felt like a cold, computational system running heavily in the background of everyday life, quietly rewriting how human beings moved and interacted. I stayed near my front window, observing without interrupting, because every single attempt at direct conversation earlier had yielded absolutely nothing useful. The SUVs were still firmly entrenched in my driveway. Their positions hadn't changed, but now I noticed something far more precise. Their physical alignment matched the newly placed curb markers outside almost perfectly, as if someone had calibrated both sides of the street to mirror each other in a master database. That realization made my attention sharpen instantly. Around 3 p.m., the first real, undeniable disruption in normal neighborhood behavior occurred. A resident 2 houses down attempted to back out of their driveway to run an errand. He had to slam on his brakes midway because a contractor vehicle had just repositioned a bright orange barrier cone directly at his exit point. There was no warning sign. There was no explanation. There was only the sudden, physical placement. The driver rolled down his window, looking completely confused, then slowly reversed back up his driveway, as if recalculating his life choices. Within minutes, another vehicle attempted to exit from the opposite end of the street and encountered the exact same obstacle. The pattern was spreading, not randomly, but sequentially, like a controlled corporate rollout. Karen Miller appeared shortly after the double lockdown. She was now accompanied by the same tablet operators and one additional man carrying large, rolled-up blueprints. They stopped at the main intersection near my street and reviewed something on a large, portable map board they had erected. Even from my distance, I could clearly see complex colored lines marking different segments of our neighborhood. Some lines were solid, some were dashed, and others were heavily overlapping. This was no longer just driveways being subtly affected. The entire circulation of the block was being hijacked. I walked outside again, this time venturing further down the concrete sidewalk to get a clearer view of the masterboard. The intense heat of the afternoon pavement rose right through my shoes, steady and unavoidable. Karen didn't acknowledge my presence at all. She continued speaking to her team in clipped tones, pointing to specific sections of the map and adjusting coordinates with small hand gestures. One of the residents approached her, visibly much more frustrated than before, demanding to know why his basic driveway access had been restricted without a single day's notice. Karen responded with the exact same controlled, robotic tone she had used all morning. She explained that the neighborhood was undergoing a phased optimization process to improve emergency access efficiency and reduce localized congestion points. The explanation sounded incredibly structured, but it completely avoided the concepts of homeowner consent or basic communication. Stepping closer, I noticed a critical detail on the map layout. The markings were not just about physical space. They included specific timing intervals. Certain driveways were labeled with strict access windows, while others were marked as completely restricted during specific peak hours. This wasn't just spatial control anymore. It was temporal control layered directly onto our daily lives. I stepped back slowly, my mind racing as I processed what that meant in practical terms. This had evolved far beyond parking disputes or minor temporary inconveniences. This was about regulating human movement across both space and time within a private residential area, implemented without a shred of legal transparency. I returned to the safety of my house and opened my laptop, focusing my energy entirely on the subcontractor chain I had identified. The logistics consultancy was heavily linked to a second-tier data analytics provider that specialized entirely in traffic simulation modeling. I reviewed their public corporate case studies online. To my horror, almost all of their past projects involved high-security urban infrastructure, commercial shipping districts, and municipal ports, not peaceful residential neighborhoods. That massive discrepancy stood out like a warning flare. Cross-referencing their client history further, I unearthed a recent, obscured reference to a pilot program involving private residential coordination systems under municipal advisory approval. The corporate language was intentionally vague, but it strongly suggested experimentation rather than a standard HOA service deployment. I sat back in my chair and stared at my mounting notes. Everything I had observed outside aligned flawlessly with a highly structured system being implemented incrementally. The precise placement of markers, the coordinated contractor movements, and the forced behavioral adaptation expected from the residents. It wasn't improvisation at all. It was the cold execution of a pre-designed model. Looking out the window one last time, I saw that one of the SUVs blocking my car had been adjusted slightly once more, now aligned almost exactly with the nearest curb marker outside. That synchronization was no longer subtle. It was a loud declaration. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I understood the true scope. Karen Miller wasn't just managing parking. She was testing exactly how far a system like this could expand before anyone formally gathered the courage to question its authority. As dusk approached, the simulation came alive. Willow Creek Estates had officially transformed into a heavily orchestrated grid where every turn, stop, and acceleration felt pre-programmed. The evening shadows lengthened across the asphalt, stretching like bars of a cage over the front lawns. Inside my dark living room, I stood near the window, watching the street with a cold focus that had completely shifted from initial confusion to deep, tactical analysis. The SUVs in my driveway had not moved for hours, but the internal significance of their placement had radically evolved. They were no longer just heavy chunks of metal occupying my personal space. They were fully integrated anchors, flawlessly aligned with the curb markers outside to lock the local node of the system into place. Right around 5 p.m., the first coordinated enforcement behavior manifested. A commercial FedEx delivery truck tried to enter the block, its engine rumbling familiarly. A contractor stationed at the main intersection simply held up a hand and pointed down at his industrial tablet. No verbal argument occurred. There was no shouting match, no negotiation. The driver simply paused for a few seconds, checked his company smartphone, and then smoothly threw the truck into reverse, changing course as if he were merely following updated instructions from his corporate GPS. Minutes later, a regular sedan approached from the opposite direction and encountered the exact same robotic response. This wasn't a matter of human judgment or an overzealous security guard. It was a unified, digital protocol being applied consistently across the entire zone. I stepped outside again, keeping my hands inside my pockets, and stopped near the very edge of the concrete sidewalk where I could get a wider view of the unfolding operation. Karen Miller was positioned like a general near the geographical center of the block, her team tightly huddled around her. The tablet. Operators were no longer moving independently or taking casual notes. They were now responding in rapid, fluid sequences, where an input on one screen instantly triggered manual adjustments elsewhere on the street. I watched in real time as a single driveway marker was shifted 3 inches to the left, and within 5 seconds, a corresponding adjustment occurred 3 houses down. The entire street was behaving like a neural network, processing structural changes as a whole rather than a set of isolated human decisions. I never consented to any of this. A neighbor near me finally snapped, his voice cracking the heavy suburban silence for the first time all day. He marched up to his property line, demanding to know why his basic ability to leave his own house required a digital sign-off from an HOA system he had never voted for. Karen didn't even look up from her screen, her voice remaining perfectly flat, insulated by bureaucratic armor. The current configuration operates under a temporary regulatory compliance framework authorized by community infrastructure optimization protocols, she droned. The jargon was a fortress, impenetrable, exhausting, and completely designed to sound official without providing a single shred of actionable detail or human accountability. During this tense exchange, I noticed something absolutely critical. The contractor vehicles were no longer just placing new markers. They were actively removing older ones as well, creating highly dynamic pathways that shifted every few minutes. That meant the system wasn't static. It was fully adaptive, learning and reshaping itself around our daily routines. Retreating inside, I bypassed the useless HOA portal entirely. I dug deep into the public municipal invoice registries, tracing the payment flow of the Sacramento logistics firm deeper into the subcontracting chain. The data led straight to a municipal advisory contractor that specialized entirely in adaptive traffic modeling for emergency response scenarios. That connection changed the entire nature of the game. This wasn't an annoying residential parking policy. This was infrastructure simulation software being deployed and tested in a live, controlled neighborhood environment. The leaked technical documents contained chilling, recurring phrases, controlled access zoning, and dynamic residential flow adjustment. The legal ambiguity was a work of art. It never explicitly stated they had the authority to seize private driveways, but it never excluded it either. Outside, the final rays of sunlight faded, leaving the SUV in my yard perfectly synchronized with the glowing curb tags, blurring the boundary between my private deeded property and the state's testing ground. Night fully settled over Willow Creek Estates, and the entire neighborhood transitioned into a chilling new operating state. The shift wasn't loud, dramatic, or marked by flashing sirens. It was purely procedural. The standard suburban streetlights flickered on at their usual regular intervals, but their pale yellow glow now reflected off hundreds of tiny, highly reflective curb markers that had silently multiplied throughout the block. Standing inside my darkened house, I watched through the blinds as all movement outside became intensely, terrifyingly structured. Vehicles no longer entered or exited the street freely. They paused at designated glowing points, idled in absolute silence, and then continued forward only when the digital path ahead was cleared by the operators. It looked less like a neighborhood where families lived and more like a controlled circulation model being stress-tested in real time. Right around 7 a.m., Karen Miller took up a permanent station at the main intersection. She was no longer walking between properties or engaging with homeowners. She stood there like an orchestrator, observing calmly while the tablet operators around her made continuous, frantic adjustments to the grid. Every few seconds, one of them would tap a screen, and the mechanical change would ripple down the long line of brake lights almost immediately. The processing speed was incredibly fast now, much faster than it had been during the morning setup phase. The experiment had clearly moved from initial hardware setup into full execution mode. I stepped outside one more time, staying close to the shadow of my porch, my eyes fixed on my driveway. The SUVs were still there, completely static, but a new detail caught my eye. A faint, glowing barcode sticker had been applied directly to my concrete curb, right adjacent to the front tire of the nearest vehicle. It matched the exact digital tagging pattern I had seen down the block, meaning my property was no longer being treated as an isolated piece of private land. It had been officially cataloged and integrated into the machine. A man living 2 houses down finally broke under the pressure. His posture rigid and tense, he marched straight across the sidewalk toward Karen, pointing an angry finger. "Show me the written document," he demanded, his voice trembling. "Show me the legal authority you are using to lock down access to my private driveway." For the first time all day, Karen actually paused before responding. She slowly looked down at her tablet, then scanned the dark street, and finally looked back at the man, her face completely vacant of emotion. "The system is operating under temporary community infrastructure authorization aligned with safety optimization protocols approved through external advisory consultation," she repeated, her voice a flawless loop. "Did the homeowners agree to this? Did we vote on this?" The man pressed, his voice rising. Instead of answering him verbally, one of the tablet operators beside her stepped forward and nudged a slider on his screen, adjusting a nearby marker by a mere few inches. A block away, a waiting vehicle's automated system instantly reacted, its headlights shifting as it was forced to turn left down an alternate route. The silent, effortless display of systemic power was more chilling than any verbal threat Karen could have uttered. It reinforced the terrifying reality that control was no longer centralized in one human decision, but distributed across an unyielding digital network. I hurried back inside and opened the HOA digital archives, determined to find the legal loophole. This time, I ignored the front pages and focused entirely on the hidden authorization metadata buried deep in the server logs. Hidden within a mass of legal jargon was a specific reference to a pilot program titled Adaptive Residential Flow Integration Trial. The document listed multiple high-level stakeholders, the logistics consultancy, the mapping analytics firm, and a municipal advisory liaison group. What stood out most wasn't the vast scope of the project, but the specific clause describing homeowner notification requirements. It stated in plain, cold text that individual homeowner acknowledgement was not required for preliminary deployment phases, as long as operational thresholds remained within advisory parameters. That single sentence created a legal loophole large enough to swallow our entire lives. It meant they could deploy the physical system first, normalize it, and deal with the questions much later. Looking back out the window, I saw the street had fully transitioned into a synchronized ballet of restriction. Vehicles waited in flawless sequence. Markers dictated exact timing. Contractors adjusted the human flow like they were tuning a massive machine rather than managing a neighborhood. One of the SUVs in my driveway was now aligned so perfectly with the glowing curb system that it appeared completely indistinguishable from the regulated layout outside. The psychological normalization had officially begun. The neighborhood was learning to treat structured restriction as standard everyday procedure rather than an unconstitutional imposition, and Karen Miller remained at the absolute center of it, waiting for the experiment to reach its final equilibrium. Midnight arrived, bringing with it what I could only describe as peak operational stability. Willow Creek Estates no longer resembled a standard American residential neighborhood. It functioned like a highly secure, automated facility where human movement, timing, and access were governed by invisible algorithmic rules that became visible only through their physical restrictions. I stood inside my pitch-black house with every single light killed, watching the street through the window blinds like a scientist observing a terrarium. The heavy SUVs in my driveway remained stubbornly in place, but they were now glowing nodes fully synthesized into the curb marker grid. The physical boundary between my deeded private property and external municipal control had become visually, legally indistinguishable. Right around 8:15 p.m., the first major macro-escalation appeared. A heavy municipal vehicle arrived at the outer entrance of the neighborhood and abruptly paused at the perimeter marker line. It didn't just drive through. It waited patiently for a digital clearance signal being generated by the contractor system embedded in our street. After a short, automated delay, the vehicle was redirected down a side access route that hadn't even existed earlier in the day. That precise moment confirmed my darkest suspicion. The trial was no longer contained within the private boundaries of our HOA. It was actively interfacing with external city traffic flow. It was expanding outward. Down at the central intersection, Karen Miller remained stationed under the harsh glare of the street lamp. Her posture had subtly changed, less administrative, more purely observational. She was no longer issuing constant instructions or checking her master sheet. The system was now executing itself with minimal human input. The tablet operators around her were rarely tapping their screens, suggesting the mathematical model had finally reached a self-stabilizing, autonomous state. I stepped outside into the crisp night air, walking slowly toward the very edge of my driveway. The pavement beneath my feet still retained the radiating heat of the day. Looking down the block, I noticed that several neighbors were also standing silently on their dark lawns. No one was speaking. No one was calling the police anymore. Everyone was just quietly observing the synchronized movement of vehicles and glowing markers, trying to understand the new rules of reality through sheer repetition rather than explanation. A resident stepped out from the shadows near my fence, whispering quietly, "Ethan, do you actually understand what they're doing to us?" I kept my eyes fixed on the street and didn't answer directly, because at that point, understanding was no longer the issue. Legal interpretation was already too late. Returning inside, I pulled up the live HOA server logs one final time. A fresh, real-time update feed had appeared, explicitly labeled System Stabilization Report. It showed active, color-coded zones across the entire neighborhood grid, logging adjustments every millisecond. Every single driveway, including my own, had been assigned a dynamic status indicator that shifted from green to amber based on total system flow rather than physical availability. That meant access to my own home was no longer determined by property ownership. It was dictated by algorithmic conditions. Tracing the digital signature of the master authorization, I found something truly terrifying. A final approval layer had been activated just hours earlier under Emergency Infrastructure Continuity provisions. The signing authority wasn't local, and it wasn't Karen Miller. It was routed straight through the municipal advisory channel deep within the city's infrastructure chain. I leaned closer to the screen, reviewing the system architecture diagram embedded in the project files. It was structured in three massive tiers. Tier 1, local deployment. Tier 2, regional integration. Tier 3, external coordination. What had started 12 hours ago as a frustrating driveway parking dispute had successfully evolved into a scalable infrastructure model, fully capable of controlling human traffic behavior far beyond our residential limits. Looking out the window, the street was a flawless machine. Commuters moved only when permitted gaps appeared. Markers guided every human footstep. Even the pedestrians seemed subtly aligned with designated pathways. The lead SUV in my yard sat perfectly synchronized with the glowing sequence, beautiful, orderly, and entirely tyrannical. The arrival of the next morning brought the terrifying weight of complete normalization. Willow Creek Estates no longer felt like a neighborhood that had undergone a radical, dystopian disruption. It felt like a system that had successfully completed its deployment phase. I stood inside my kitchen as the first pale light of dawn pressed through the window blinds, illuminating a street that now moved with absolute, terrifyingly measured precision. The plastic curb markers were still firmly in place, but they were no longer being shifted or adjusted by workers. They had become static, accepted reference points for a traffic flow pattern that had stabilized overnight. Vehicles entered the block, paused at precise intervals, and exited according to automated timing sequences that required zero visible human coordination. The entire rhythm of the street felt completely rehearsed. My private driveway remained heavily integrated into the system grid, the three SUVs positioned exactly where the alignment logic dictated. The distinction between what legally belonged to me and what was algorithmically assigned to the state had vanished. Around 7 p.m., the formal presence of external oversight materialized. Two city municipal representatives stood at the main entrance of the neighborhood, wearing high-visibility vests and calmly reviewing printed documentation alongside a massive tablet interface. They weren't speaking loudly or arguing with homeowners. They were simply observing, cross-checking data codes, and recording metrics. One of them pointed toward our internal street network, nodded with satisfaction, and made a quick note on his device before stepping back. Karen Miller arrived shortly after the city officials. She was no longer directing adjustments, yelling instructions, or rushing down sidewalks. She was merely walking alongside the system, monitoring its autonomous performance rather than controlling it. Her plastic clipboard was still tucked under her arm, but for the first time since this nightmare began, it remained completely closed. I stepped outside onto my porch, the morning air biting cold against my skin. The street was already fully active, yet completely quiet. A commercial delivery van glided seamlessly through the cul-de-sac, guided flawlessly by the existing marker layout, its motion entirely uninterrupted, smooth, and predictable. That absolute predictability was the most unsettling part of all. A neighbor from across the street slowly walked out to fetch his morning paper, stopping briefly as Karen walked past. "Is this setup permanent now, Karen?" he asked, his voice completely flat, drained of all the anger and resistance he had carried yesterday. "The current phase is under evaluation and subject to standard external review protocols," Karen responded smoothly, her eyes tracking a passing car rather than looking at the human being in front of her. She didn't elaborate, and the neighbor didn't push for answers. Instead, he simply nodded, turned around, and walked back inside his house. The system had transitioned from experimental deployment into accepted reality. I returned to my desk and accessed the final update logs on the server. The master system status displayed a single, definitive line of text, full integration achieved under advisory compliance threshold. Below it was the final synchronization approval from the City Infrastructure Board. It was over. The system had been accepted far beyond our neighborhood layer. It had been seamlessly absorbed into a broader framework of municipal population control testing. I closed the laptop, walked to the window, and stood perfectly still. Outside, the neighborhood continued functioning under the exact same structured flow that had formed over the previous 24 hours. No one looked confused anymore. No one was staring at the SUVs blocking their cars. They were adapting to the cage, moving within their assigned time slots as if the markers had always existed. That realization carried more terrifying weight than any physical confrontation ever could. Nothing had been reversed. Nothing had been liberated. The intrusion had simply been accepted as the new baseline of daily life. Karen Miller remained standing at the edge of the street, no longer initiating change, only confirming stability. And I finally understood that the most critical shift in the world isn't the moment a system takes away your freedom. It's the quiet, ordinary moment when everyone stops remembering that they ever had the right to question it.